This is the fourth episode of Faith and Science in the News. I'm your host, Frank Lyon. This podcast is brought to you by the Blues to Joy Ministry Project. In the last podcast, we discussed one of the two scientific theories that most people are familiar, Darwin's theory of evolution. We found that modern scientific evidence does not support the predictions made by the theory. In a future podcast, we will examine the other famous theory, Einstein's theory of general relativity, and determine how its predictions have held up given recent evidence from science. In today's podcast, we are going to discuss the elephant that is always in the room when issues of faith and science are discussed among Christians. That elephant is the debate between old earth creationists and young earth creationists. I grew up attending a conservative evangelical church in the 1950s. I do not remember anyone telling me about dinosaurs being on Noah's Ark in Sunday school, or that both human and dinosaur fossilized footprints had been found in the same rock strata at a location in Texas. I don't remember any discussions about the age of the universe or Earth. Though I was unaware of it, there was a conversation going on that would be revealed by a book in 1961. As I transitioned from high school to college in 1970, I read that book, titled The Genesis Flood, The Biblical Record and Its Scientific Implications, by John C. Whitcomb and Henry M. Morris. As a Christian, and at a point early in my university science education, I was drawn to the evidences for young earth creationism discussed in the book. Two of the main evidences discussed in the book were that the universe and earth were young, created only a few thousand years ago, and that the geological strata and the fossils contained by those strata were all laid down during Noah's flood, described as flood geology. This book was the beginning of the modern young earth creationist movement. Some of the evidences for young earth creationism that were cited in the original edition of the Whitcomb and Morris book disappeared in later editions. One example is the claim that both dinosaur and human fossilized footprints are found in the Glen Rose geological formation associated with the Paluxy Riverbed near the town of Glen Rose, Texas. The implication was that man and dinosaur were alive on the earth at the same time. Once it was determined that all the footprints were only from dinosaurs, young earth creationist apologists informed their followers to no longer use these once supposed facts in their arguments. These failed evidences obviously did not come from God's inerrant word, and were not supported by scientific investigations. Where did these other discarded young earth creationist evidences come from? Old earth creationists have historically agreed with the findings of scientific investigations related to the age of the earth. They have no issue with today's present understanding that the universe and earth are a few billion years old and not a few thousand years old, as believed by the young earth creationists. In 1917, a 4-volume set of books titled The Fundamentals, A Testimony of Truth, was published. It was a compilation of a series of 90 articles published between 1910 and 1915, defending Orthodox Christianity against the liberal theology of higher criticism that arose in the 19th century. A number of the articles discussed in the book covered the topic of faith and science. These conservative, fundamentalist Protestant writers were all old earth creationists. In 1925, at the Scopes trial, William Jennings Bryan, the attorney for the anti-evolution side, was an old earth creationist. What happened between the late 1920s and the publication of Whitcomb and Morris's book in 1961 that brought about the emergence of young earth creationism within evangelical and fundamentalist churches. What happened were the writings of an amateur geologist named George Macready Price. He was a disciple of the co-founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Ellen White. Ellen White had visions of a young earth created in several literal days, and that the flood of Noah had deposited all the geological strata along with the fossils they contained worldwide. The concept of a geological flood column already existed before her visions. Though having only a grade school education, Price began to do research in geology to provide evidence supporting the visions of Ellen White. Whitcomb and Morris's book, The Genesis Flood, borrowed a substantial amount of material from the writings of Price. Before settling on Henry Morris as his co-author for The Genesis Flood, Whitcomb had actually considered Price for that position. It is well documented that in the 30-odd years between the Scopes trial and the publication of The Genesis Flood, there was a focused effort on the part of Adventists to have their young earth creationist beliefs introduced into evangelical Christian churches. That was ultimately accomplished with the publication of The Genesis Flood. Ronald Numbers, an ex-Adventist who became a professor of history of science at the University of Wisconsin, documents the process used by the Adventists to introduce their ideas into evangelical churches in his book titled The Creationists. I would also recommend to you a paper by seminary professor Kenneth D. Keithley titled The Confessions of a Disappointed Young Earther. You should also check out a book by another seminary professor, Ted Cabal, titled Controversy of the Ages: Why Christians Should Not Divide Over the Age of the Earth. He also discusses how Adventists influenced the introduction of young earth creationism into evangelical circles. On my blog for this episode, I will provide links for these references, and you will find other resources related to this topic on my website. When you do the research, you will discover that many of the arguments for young earth creationism, particularly where they touch on geology, fossils, and the age of the universe, find their source not in Scripture or science, but in Seventh-day Adventist apologetics. Join us for the next podcast as we investigate Einstein's theory of general relativity. This is Faith and Science in the News, hosted by Frank Lyon.